How one stuck ship cost global trade billions. One gust of wind. That's all it took. Not an explosion, not a conflict, not some catastrophic engineering flaw that had been building for generations. Just wind. A ferocious gust on a particularly terrible day struck a particularly massive ship. What unfolded in the hours and days that followed, and what it ultimately cost the rest of the world, is a story worth telling. March 23, 2021, a container ship by the name of Ever Given pushed northward into the Suez Canal. The vessel is staggering in scale, 400 meters from bow to stern, longer than the Empire State Building stands tall if you were to tip that skyscraper onto its side. She can carry upward of 20,000 shipping containers in a single voyage. That morning, a sandstorm swept through the region, swallowing visibility and driving winds powerful enough to grab the ship's colossal hull the way a storm grabs an open sail. The Ever Given lost steerage. She swung. And then she lodged herself diagonally, completely, across the width of the canal, bow buried into one bank, stern driven hard into the other. Sit with that image for a moment. At that particular stretch, the Suez Canal runs about 200 meters across. The Ever Given is 400 meters long. She didn't simply block the waterway. She became the waterway's new wall, and that wall wasn't going anywhere. Why any of this mattered to people who had never once thought about the Suez Canal in their lives comes down to a single number: 12%. Roughly 12% of everything traded across the globe moves through this one narrow corridor. It is the shortest path the sea offers between Asia and Europe, stitching the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Bypass it, and a ship must sail all the way around the southern tip of Africa instead, burning an extra 7 to 14 days in the process. On any ordinary day, approximately 50 ships thread through the canal. For 6 days in March of 2021, not one did. The canal had gone dark before, though never for anything like this. When the Suez Canal first opened in 1869, it was nothing short of a triumph of human ambition. A decade of grueling labor, roughly 1.5 million workers carving 120 miles of waterway through Egyptian desert by hand and machine, celebrated with a Verdi opera, Aida, commissioned for the occasion. In the century and a half that followed, it had closed 3 times, and every single time, war was the reason. The 1956 Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War in 1967, which left the canal dark for 8 consecutive years afterward, its waters littered with sunken hulls and unexploded ordnance that crews spent years recovering. And briefly again during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Each of those shutdowns was a decision made by governments, a deliberate instrument of geopolitical pressure. The Ever Given was something else entirely. The first time in the canal's approximately 150-year existence that the whole thing ground to a halt simply because one vessel couldn't hold its line. Egyptian officials were, to put it mildly, not pleased to have their canal remembered that way. Now, let's get into what that actually meant in dollars, beginning with the figure that landed on front pages everywhere. Allianz, the insurance behemoth, calculated that every day the canal stayed blocked was costing global trade somewhere between $6 and $10 billion. Lloyd's List, the shipping industry's own benchmark data service, landed on a comparable estimate, around $9 billion per day, which works out to roughly $400 million every single hour. Take a moment with that number. $400 million an hour is more than what most Super Bowl spots cost, times approximately 55, hemorrhaging out into shipping delays hour after hour for 6 straight days. At both ends of the canal, the queue swelled past 400 vessels while the Ever Given sat unmoved, wedged sideways and going nowhere. Some of those ships were loaded with consumer goods. Others carried crude oil and liquefied natural gas, energy cargo that typically accounts for somewhere between 5 and 10% of everything the canal moves on an ordinary day. A handful of captains eventually ran out of patience and turned their ships south, choosing to add a week and a half of sailing around the African continent rather than sit indefinitely in a traffic jam with no visible end in sight. The cargo trapped in that bottleneck represented a genuinely random cross-section of the entire world economy. Furniture, automotive components, home fitness equipment at a moment when demand for personal gym gear was still running hot from pandemic-era lockdowns. Electronic parts destined for factories assembling everything from smartphones to household appliances. Industry analysts pointed out at the time that the obstruction hit at a particularly brutal moment for retailers already scrambling to restock shelves gutted by a year of pandemic-fueled online purchasing, which meant the delayed shipments didn't simply wait in line quietly. They sent shockwaves forward into bare shelves and postponed product launches for months on end, across stores that had no way of knowing their inventory was, at that precise moment, sitting sideways in the Egyptian desert. Getting the ship unstuck demanded a genuinely remarkable, somewhat absurd marriage of raw force and methodical patience. The Suez Canal Authority brought in Boskalis, a Dutch marine services firm, along with its salvage arm Smet, the same outfit that had previously tackled the sunken Russian nuclear submarine Kursk and the capsized Italian cruise liner Costa Concordia, two of the most technically punishing marine recovery operations of recent decades. The engineers working on site moved through a layered series of contingency plans. Plan A relied on dredging alone. Plan B introduced powerful cutter suction dredgers to excavate the sediment packed beneath the hull. Plan C, the outcome everyone was hoping to avoid, meant physically lifting containers off the Ever Given one by one, using floating cranes to shed enough weight that the vessel could be raised clear of the canal floor, a process that, by itself, could have consumed several additional weeks. Plan C never saw the light of day. In the end, salvage teams brought in 11 harbor tugs and 2 purpose-built deep-sea tugboats, the Alp Guard and the Carlo Magna, vessels powerful enough to handle some of the biggest ships on the planet, while simultaneously dredging an estimated 30,000 cubic meters of mud and sand from beneath and around the bow. What they were doing, in effect, was digging out a beached whale made of steel. The teams timed the final push to align with an unusually high spring tide, buying the tugboats a few precious extra feet of water depth. At 3:05 in the afternoon local time on March 29th, 6 days after the Ever Given first ran aground, her stern broke free, the rest of the hull following close behind to the sound of genuine, unrestrained cheering from the tugboat crews. The moment was caught on camera and watched by millions of people who had, by that point, transformed a maritime accident into a full-scale internet event. Getting the ship unstuck was, relatively speaking, the straightforward part. Working through the queue of more than 400 vessels waiting on either side took until April 3rd, with the canal operating at more than double its normal daily capacity, over 100 transits in a single day just to chew through the backlog. The blockage also became, almost immediately, one of the biggest collective jokes the internet had shared in years, and that cultural moment carried its own strange little economic footnote. A single small excavator, absurdly tiny against the grounded hull in an aerial photograph, doing its best to dig the ship free, became an instant global meme, reprinted, remixed, and scattered across every corner of social media within days. Someone registered the domain astheshipstillstuck.com and later put it up for sale as an NFT, a peculiar postscript in which the internet's fixation on a wedged cargo ship briefly generated its own miniature self-contained commercial product. Now, the question of who actually paid for all of this, because the bill broke apart into several very different pieces, and one of those pieces became a genuinely extraordinary legal battle. Begin with the Suez Canal Authority itself, the Egyptian government body that runs the canal and collects a toll from every vessel that passes through, sometimes exceeding $100,000 per ship. For the duration of the blockage, the authority estimated it was hemorrhaging roughly $15 million a day in transit fees alone, on top of whatever the salvage operation itself was costing. Then there's Maersk, the world's second-largest shipping company, which had multiple vessels trapped in that floating traffic jam. A University of Gothenburg academic study, published afterward, put the damage to Maersk specifically at just under $89 million. That figure accounts for fuel burned by idling ships, the cost of rerouting around Africa, delayed cargo, and the carbon toll of taking the long way. An estimated 44,574 additional tons of emissions from Maersk's fleet alone. Then there's what happened to the freight market itself, which essentially fell apart for several weeks. Shipping rates on the China to Mediterranean corridor exploded by roughly 500% compared to the same period the previous year. A standard container that would have run you about $1,500 to ship was suddenly going for more than $7,000, and all of this landed on top of a global shipping industry that was already buckling under pandemic demand and a stubborn shortage of containers. The Ever Given didn't create that broader crisis. It took a situation that was already bad and made it dramatically worse, instantly, in the one place on Earth where it could do the most damage. Here's the part of this story that most people never followed, because it unfolded quietly long after the ship had been pulled free and the internet had moved on to something else. The Suez Canal Authority came after the ship's Japanese owner, Shoei Kisen Kaisha, with a compensation claim totaling approximately $916 million. Take a moment with that number. $916 million for a grounding that lasted 6 days, spilled nothing, and injured nobody. Buried inside that figure was $300 million described explicitly as a salvage bonus, and another $300 million for something the authority called loss of reputation. The argument being that the Suez Canal's standing in the world had taken a hit, and that hit had a dollar value attached to it. The ship's insurers, the UK club, went on record calling the demand extraordinarily large and largely unsupported. Egypt was unmoved. An Egyptian court ordered the Ever Given seized, cargo included, worth upward of $600 million, and kept the 25-person crew detained on board, effectively holding the entire vessel, its contents, and the people living on it as collateral until someone came to the table with a check. The vessel remained anchored in the Great Bitter Lake, a wide stretch positioned roughly at the canal's midpoint, for over 3 months while legal teams hashed out the details. The Suez Canal Authority eventually walked back its original demand, settling on $550 million. A formal agreement finally landed in July 2021, nearly 4 months after the ship first wedged itself across the waterway, and the precise terms of that settlement were never fully disclosed, a standard outcome in maritime compensation cases of this magnitude. Once released, the ship resumed its journey and eventually reached Rotterdam. Arriving months behind its original schedule, its cargo finally handed off to customers who had, in more than a few instances, simply given up waiting and placed their orders somewhere else. And then came another blow. The ship's owner invoked something called general average, a legal principle so old it predates modern shipping entirely. The concept is straightforward in its ruthlessness. When extraordinary action is required to save a vessel and its cargo from disaster, every party with goods aboard must shoulder a proportional share of the costs, regardless of whether their particular containers were touched. Every company that had loaded freight onto the Ever Given, electronics manufacturers, furniture importers, fitness equipment suppliers, found themselves liable for a slice of the salvage bill calculated against the declared value of whatever they'd shipped. It's a mechanism most people have never encountered, quietly distributing the financial weight of a single rescue operation across hundreds of businesses scattered across the globe. For smaller shippers in particular, navigating the general average bond became its own ordeal. Months of documentation, legal review, and bureaucratic back and forth before they could so much as lay hands on cargo they had already paid for. Sitting behind all of this was the reinsurance industry. The companies that insure the insurance companies, and industry analysts at the time observed that a loss of this scale and complexity, a grounding claim, cargo delay claims, and a 9-figure compensation dispute, all connected to a single event, would most likely be absorbed by a small number of large marine reinsurers rather than any individual insurer, spreading the financial blow thinly enough across the global insurance market that no single company was ever genuinely at risk. That's exactly what reinsurance is built to do. It's structured so that even a spectacularly costly front-page accident like this one barely shows up as a footnote in the annual results of the companies that ultimately carry it, which is a large part of why, unlike a bank collapse or a corporate bankruptcy, nobody inside the insurance world lost much sleep over contagion spreading outward from one stranded ship. Here's the detail that deserves the same careful attention we give to a valve a mile beneath the ocean's surface or a levee constructed on soil too soft to bear the weight placed on it. Egypt's own investigation into the incident determined that human error played a meaningful role, pointing specifically to decisions made by the ship's captain during the sandstorm. High winds and poor visibility were real that day, and nobody disputes that. But investigators concluded the vessel had been moving faster than conditions safely permitted, and they raised serious questions about whether the crew had adequately reckoned with the storm's intensity before steering into the narrower, single-lane southern portion of the canal, the stretch where the ship eventually ran aground, a section that, unlike parts of the canal widened in 2016 to accommodate two-way traffic, left absolutely no margin for a vessel to lose control without shutting down the entire waterway. What did the world actually receive in return for a bill of that magnitude? The Ever Given turned out to be the most expensive crash course in supply chain vulnerability that most executives had ever personally witnessed, and the corporate world paid attention. In the years that followed, major retailers and manufacturers pushed harder on efforts already in motion, diversifying shipping routes, building out bigger inventory cushions rather than leaning entirely on just-in-time delivery, and in certain cases, moving production closer to end consumers specifically to limit their exposure to any single choke point anywhere on the map. Just-in-time logistics, the philosophy of keeping inventory as lean as possible and having fresh stock land exactly when it's needed, had ruled global manufacturing and retail thinking for decades, celebrated above all for stripping warehousing costs down to almost nothing. The Ever Given, hitting an already battered pandemic-era shipping market like a second punch, became one of the most vivid real-world demonstrations of that philosophy's fundamental flaw. A system engineered to carry almost no reserve has almost no reserve the instant anything goes sideways. The Suez Canal Authority itself poured additional investment into dredging and widening further sections of the Southern Canal, targeting directly the precise stretch where the Ever Given had lodged itself, with the goal of enabling wider two-way traffic and lowering the chances of history repeating itself. That investment ended up mattering far sooner than anyone had anticipated, though for reasons nobody had foreseen. Beginning in late 2023, Houthi militants operating out of Yemen started firing missiles and launching drone strikes against commercial vessels in the Red Sea, the very corridor of water that feeds directly into the southern mouth of the Suez Canal. Unlike a sandstorm, this was not a threat that blew itself out in less than a week. Major carriers, Maersk among them, the same company that had absorbed tens of millions of dollars in Ever Given-related losses just years before, began voluntarily steering entire fleets the long way around Africa rather than chance the Red Sea at all, even knowing the detour tax on roughly 10 to 14 days and a punishing fuel bill to every voyage. Suez Canal traffic collapsed by more than half through 2024 compared to previous years, and Egypt's own government acknowledged it was hemorrhaging billions of dollars annually in transit fees as a direct consequence, a disruption that was longer, costlier, and more grinding than 6 days pinned behind one sideways ship, playing out in the exact same choke point the whole world had spent 3 years swearing it would never again allow itself to be so dangerously reliant upon. Set the entire story out end to end. One sandstorm, one gust of wind with enough force to catch a steel hull stretching the length of 4 football fields. 6 days sitting crosswise in a canal 200 meters across. Somewhere between $6 and $10 billion a day installed global commerce. A $916 million compensation claim that managed to include a line item for wounded pride. A ship and its crew held in a lake for more than 3 months while lawyers ran up their hours. And a freight market that was already operating on fumes shoved further past the edge for months after that. The Ever Given did not run aground because global shipping is broken at its core. It ran aground because one ship, on one unusually windy morning in the one section of canal that offered absolutely no margin for error, laid bare exactly how much of the entire modern economy quietly runs on a single 200-meter strip of water cutting through the Egyptian desert, and just how ruinous things get the moment something goes wrong in precisely the wrong place.
Hi guys, welcome to my video. Please keep in mind that everything is in this video is fictional and contains predictions. I produce all the videos on this channel by myself. It means a lot to me. If you like the video and leave comments, thank you. Enjoy the video.